So we're back into the app now, right? So let's look at how a registration becomes real a seller's intelligence. We'll get to the point where we're looking at sales agents, but right now we're going to cover the registration of a new regulatory. Like I said before, anything submitted can be active, all statuses, superseded, pending territory manager review, where we're able to look at different all risk levels and start this registration for a new regulatory for where industry analyst is doing their industry work per territory. So going into the registration, right, there's this wizard, right, where we're able to enter the core identity, for example, here, GDPR regulation. So everything's for industry is mapped to different industry cloud verticals. This is uh, Microsoft Sales tracked model where they're able to um, organize industry codes based on industry cloud vertical. So for let's say for financial services, we can pick accounting. And if for this regulatory registration, we're able to map it to a different compliance domain. Maybe we do it in Europe. And let's pick a compliance domain. So based on the industry taxonomy crosswalk there, I was able to design between compliance domains. There's this territory mapping and industry mapping to that compliance domain. So what it's telling us is that for the mapping between the industry and territory for that compliance domain, that mapping doesn't exist. So the industry analyst can submit it, but the process will trigger the industry lead to say, okay, maybe there's some registrations coming through that we need to create this crosswalk mapping between the territory and industry for that compliance domain. Um, Essentially, for the accounting vertical, it's telling you, okay, for that industry, here's some mapped compliance domains for that industry. So maybe we select one of these guys here, and it's telling us, okay, this regulatory this analyst is looking registering for validation can be is already has a map domain. So for intake source, usually things come in through a regulatory alert from those SLA dashboards that we've seen. I have a process running that really creates those alerts for tasks that are generated for the industry analysts for that territory as a business team unit. Sellers may request incoming ones based on the tasks. Also, the annual review for different regulatory that needs to be reviewed. You have a partner signal. Maybe you got a trigger from a partner that needs some questions answered for a client they're engaging, and they need some more grounding context to provide the regulatory insights to deal with those internal operations. Um, so let's go with a regulatory alert. Market context just give you a general registration, a summary for that regulation that you're registering. So you don't have to fill that out. The legislation name, we're just going to call this legislation. Of course, you got to register URL to that registration because it's all about giving the context of a validated regulation that's mapped to some type of online resource, because we know with compliance domains and regulatory and the territories, all the resources on the laws and regulations on the websites. So by validating these registrations per territory and per industry code, when a client goes through that future engaged AI synthesizer for determining transformation and project waves, it will look up onto these legislations and these regulations that's validated, and it'll deal with that hallucination gap that I was dealing with in the AI synthesizer. And it gives us space where this enables the industry team to collaborate. So let's say this one is more of a regulation. So I'll just register a generic URL here. Okay. Now, there's this repository, right, of registered sources that can be mapped to this legislation if there isn't a regulator website available. Usually, the industry analysts are always mapping regulatory resources to that compliance domain, where regulation registrations can be mapped as a crosswalk between the compliance domain, the industry code, and the territory. But from the compliance domain, there's this generic list of regulatory resources that exist for that compliance that can be associated to this legislation if there is no regulator applied to this registration. So we don't have to do that, but we're going to kind of put in our own regulatory. So this one is going to be a national authority. We're just going to call it regulator body. And of course, put a website here. Okay. So now we get to the classification part of this regulatory registration. What is the risk impact of this regulation for that compliance domain? And the industry analyst can come up with that different risk rating, a high risk rating, maybe it's a medium. And for that industry, is this a mandatory compliance? So when the synthesizer analyzes that opportunity mapped to that lead qualification, it grabs the industry and grabs the regulations that's mandatory for the hypothesis synthesizer that goes into the agentic orchestration that I'm going to demo in future series. So the analyst is able to set that mandatory as a mandatory compliance. Okay. An effective date is, what is the effective date of this registration, right? So we'll put a date of when the regulation was engaged. What is the compliance deadline? Because every regulation is going to have its own regulation period. So the industry analyst knows this. So there's a deadline for that compliance level tracking. So maybe it's going to be done in August, or in August in about the next 2 years. That regulation goes in effect for the next 2 years or whatnot. Okay. There's a significant date for interfacing with that regulation, right? So let's say quarterly you have to interface with it, right? So maybe in August 2026 you have to engage that. Well, for regulation, there's this last verified date, but I don't think this needs to be here because for new regulatory registration, the last verified date would be the date at which the territory manager validates this pipeline for this registration. So this one is going to be moved out of here, but we'll just choose a generic date for this today. So able to review the different entries that the analyst has entered. So there's a rule that this can be applied to. So there's some notes for the applicability for that regulatory registration, right? Apply to all opportunities, right? It just provides extra context for the AI synthesizer when they're correlating the opportunity. There's some notes for that regulation, right? So maybe there's some different notes that the analyst has analyzed, right? They want to enter here, right? Here in the future, we're going to expand this out to being able to map this to a solution area and the persona of the buyer. So at this point, this data may look up on the opportunity itself, right? To map that opportunity. Okay, what solution areas this opportunity is going to be engaged, and what's the person of that primary contact for the opportunity. Maybe it's the CTO, the CFO, CEO, or operations director. And there's a sales narrative that goes to this. So for now, these are optional. These would kind of get pulled from that opportunity anyway. So it's really not important for the first phase of this AI synthesizer that I've designed in the next series that I'll demo. So everything's saving. And now you have all of these registrations here. So it comes in as pending. Every time you enter it, there's a pending status, right? Because the regulation is going through the first phase, right? Of, qualification, making sure everything is drafted. So this is the engagement with the industry team to enable industry registrations that's mapped to these different taxonomies. Let's look at the taxonomies right quick. Now everything's globally mapped, right? Where we're able to look at different industry codes and identify different compliance domains that's registered in the taxonomy, and also bring in all the global territories, right? And for that compliance domain, you have these different generic regulatory sources that we're able to pick out for regulation that needs to be associated. It's currently in the catalog. The crosswalk is also important, right? Because this is where the industries are mapped to the compliance domains. Also for the territories, these are different. This is how compliance domains are mapped to different territories. So there can be different entries that can be entered, right? From the industry leads, they can do further engage different territory mappings, thus being able to enable the industry team to collaborate